bottom of page 144, Ois Yud, we were speaking about the combination of the going from the highest, most levels, like Moshe Rabbeinu was in the highest, most level of Seder Ishtalshalos, and the while being an Neshama Beguf, which is something that is a very difficult situation to be able to reach, that he should be able to be from the highest level and still at the same time be able to be in a physical body. And together with that, we have in a similar vein in many of the other matters having to do with Gulas Mitzrayim, that it had to be with, from the perspective of down here below, there needed to be that the Yidden did not just take, for example, the riches, the Yidden needed to be given the riches of Mitzrayim in a friendly way, and that Pari himself would be the one that would give them the zvachim and the oilers, etc., all the sacrifices that they would use, etc. So now this is all a preparation for Matan Torah, where Matan Torah, we said, has to be the dira batachtoinim, has to be the joining of the spiritual and the physical. And similar to that, this is all a preparation for the Geula Hasidah, which will have the completion of the joining of both of these together. So now, after explaining how Geulas Mitzrayim is to bring to that state of Matan Torah, which Matan Torah is about a preparation for Mashiach's times, he's going to explain that Mashiach's times is in a so much greater fashion. Oisyu, Avol Geulas Mitzrayim lohoisa shleimus birra tachten, the ultimate perfection of refining that which is down here below, was not attained when the Yidden left Mitzrayim. Even though, as we said, B'shalach Parias that the Torah attributes to the Yidden leaving Mitzrayim to Pari, and the amount of things that they gave them, the wealth, and Pari himself sending sacrifices to be offered and so on, yet it was not completed. Like it's understood from the fact that there had to be that the nation ran away. In other words, they were still fearful of the Egyptians. That means the Egyptians were still considered by them as a threat. Top on the next page, that you left the land of Mitzrayim in a rush, because the bad was still in its full strength. And Chassidus explains both the external bad, meaning the Egyptians were there in their full strength, and also within the Yidden themselves, they had not completely eradicated the bad within them, and therefore they wouldn't have agreed, the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, to leave Mitzrayim unless they thought it was for a short trip. How do we know that the bad of Mitzrayim was only was in its full strength? Like it's understood from the fact that afterwards that the Egyptians chased after the Bnei Yisrael. And the leaving Mitzrayim was not completed until the Yidden saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore, until Kriyas Yamsuf, when the Yamsuf itself spit out the dead bodies of the Egyptians. The Jewish people were fearful of Mitzrayim, and they were in a state of that the Egyptians were, at least in their mind, in their full strength. But even beforehand, the very fact that they chased after them and so on. So therefore, even though there was the input of the Tachtoin, there was the involvement of the below, there was the idea of having a home down here below, the precursor for it, but it wasn't the complete transformation of the below. The ultimate imperfection of the refinement of the world will be specifically at the end of this final exile. The Gula Mitzvah Shleima, the true and complete redemption, like your days going out of the land of Mitzrayim, I will show you wonders. Which means on the one hand, this means to show that it's the same idea. Well, what's taking place when the Yidden left Mitzrayim will be when Mashiach comes. This type of merging and meshing between the above and below, that even the below is participating in it. On the other hand, it's the wonders in comparison to that time, because what didn't happen that time, that should be a complete negation of the bad, will take place when Mashiach comes. Therefore, the way how we will leave in our present goals and go to the redemption, the Navi says it will be in such a way that you will not leave in a way of a rush, and you will not be running away when you leave this present exile. Why will that be so? Because the only time when you need to run away is like the marshal that's given is if you have a prison and a person broke out of the prison, he needs to run away from the prison. But what happens if the prison and the guards and the government that imprisons the person is all ceased to be? So then there's no need to run away. The same thing when Mashiach comes, the spirit of impurity that Hashem says, I will remove from the earth. Therefore, we will leave exile. Bizrizus, we will not, just dally around and just hang around for the fun of it, but it won't be in a rush, in a pressure, in a way of a calmness of soul and a calmness of body. And an ultimate perfection and health. The shamas begufim souls and body. And we go through immediately without any cessation whatsoever, the everlasting life, of souls and bodies, the true and complete redemption, the ultimate and perfection of reward, like we said before. In other words, not like it's brought down in some places that before Tchias HaMesim, all souls will have to leave the bodies, and then there will be Tchias HaMesim, the resurrection of the dead. The Rebbe always speaks, or lately, especially on the heels of Tashim Mem Ches, the Rebbe used to speak about Salat, especially soon after the passing of the Rebbe, that there's no need for the souls to leave the body before the Geulah, before Tchias HaMesim, but will go immediately over from a state of Golus in bodies to the everlasting life of Mashiach times. Now the Rebbe connects all of this with Yud Shvat and the Friedrich Rebbe. Inyan Anal, Zayich Gamla, Yud Shvat, the above mentioned matter is applicable also to Yud Shvat. Yom Hailula de Kvachis Marich Hamed Munasidarein, the day of the yard sign, known as a day of celebration. Hilul means a celebration of my father-in-law, the leader of our generation. Yud Shvat this year receives its brachas, and this year from the Shabbos Parshas Boil Pari, meaning because it's in the week following Parshas Boy, and everything coming in the week following of Shabbos, so Shabbos draws down brachas for everything in the following week, including the special days of significance throughout that week. And since the Yud Shvat was in the week following Parshas Boy, so its brachas are coming from Shabbos Parshas Boy. And there's a further connection that Rebbe says between the Friedrich Rebbe's yahrzeit and Parshas Boy. By Stalkus heute b'shnas Tavshin Yud b'Shabbos Parshas Boy Atzma. The Friedrich Rebbe actually passed away in 1950 in Parshas Boy itself. So we see that the Stalkus of the Friedrich Rebbe has to do with Parshas Boy. So he's going to make that connection now. It's known, the day of a passing of a tzaddik, his neshama goes up above. Yachad kol ma'isa v'terase v'avodase, along with all of his actions, his Torah and the service, asher avad kol yimei chayav, that he served all the days of his life, like the Alter Rebbe says in the end of Tanya, the famous Geras HaKodesh Siman Chav Zayin. It's not just that it's a one-way street, that it goes upwards, but also all of this power and energy that comes together from the joining and elevation of all of the tzaddiks actions and service, that power becomes revealed and shines in a way of revelation from above to below, and it impacts this world. As the Pasuk in Tehillim says, it affects salvations within the land. So the same thing by the Stalkos, the day of the Stalkos of the Tzaddik affects all of these salvations within the land. In other words, down here in our world. And this is not just a one-time event, that at the date of the yard when the tzaddik passed away a long time ago, so that's when it affects all of this down here below. But also the yard b'chol shana v'shana, and the yard in every single year, neisefes aliyah shaloi ba'erech, is added an elevation that's incomparable, v'nishmas ba'al ha'ilullah, in the neshama of the one whose yard it is. That's the reason why we say Kaddish on the day of the yard every single year. And the elevation and the ascent in one ascent after another ascent, that the reason that every single year, since the neshama goes up higher and higher, and one of the instruments of that ascent is the recitation of Kaddish, the saying of Kaddish, helps and is part of the ascent of the neshama, and that's why every single year we say Kaddish on the day of the yard because of the ascent of the neshama to higher and higher levels. So therefore, that ascent also, like the Rebbe is going to go on to explain, and like the Rebbe says over there in Tanya, affects us down here as well. And now he's going to connect it using the terminology that we were talking about earlier in the Sicha. The Signat Parshas say, in the language of the Parshas boy that we were talking about before in the Sicha, Yom Yud Shvat Nasa Eitzel Balai Lula, on the day of Yud Shvat becomes by the one whose yahrzeit it is, in other words, by the Frierdiker Rebbe, Moshe Rabbeinu Shebedereinu. The Frierdiker Rebbe is the Moshe Rabbeinu of our generation. Yadu, as it's known, Shpashtus of the Moshe B'chol Dora V'Dora, that there is the extension and expansion of Moshe in every generation, and the Frierdiker Rebbe was the Moshe Rabbeinu of our generation. Boy al Pari, he was told, come to Pari. The Ayele Kuchebrichu Idrin Basar Idrin. That Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu go. That Hashem brought Moshe Rabbeinu in to chambers within chambers, which corresponds, the Rebbe says, to what the Rebbe uses the term in Igeres HaKodesh, Be'ilu Yachar Ilu, that when a tzaddik, its yards it comes, he's got up in elevations and ascent higher and higher. El Pari the Kedusha, going back to the expression of the Zohar concerning Moshe Rabbeinu, that he goes up to Pari of holiness, the Pari of the level of holiness we explained earlier, becomes opened and loosened from it and becomes released all the lights. And every year, and similar to this in this year, is added to this, an even greater elevation, till it's incomparably higher. In other words, the ascent and the elevation of the neshama on the yard every single year is higher and higher than the year before, to such a degree that it's incomparable even to how much the ascent was previous years. But just like we spoke about by Moshe Rabbeinu, it's not just about his ascent above, but actually it was about Moshe Rabbeinu being a neshama and a guf, coming down to the being in the physical body. In a similar way, the ascent of the Frierdiker Rebbe is about impacting the physical world. So it says, this revelation from what it says, come to Pari, by the leader of our generation, that the leader and the head of the generation is includes in it the entire generation. So therefore, it's the Rebbe is implying that this revelation is not just something that's for and only by the Frierdiker Rebbe, but this is a revelation that's for and at and to all of the generation. This is drawn down, becomes revealed down here below, and it affects salvations within the land. It's a call by all the members of the generation. And what is one of the facilitators for this? What causes this to happen because each and every one of us has the Moshe that goes into party. Especially because the Moshe that's within every single Yid. So since every single Yid has a Moshe Rabbeinu, so therefore that revelation manifests by him. And in the case of all the members of the generation, the way it's manifested is in the way of Neshamas Begufim Dafka, souls within bodies, just like Moshe Rabbeinu did not leave his body to be able to attain this great revelation. Top of the next page. Especially that this generation, like the one whose yahrzeit said, it is the final generation of the exile, and it's the first generation of the redemption. So we're literally on the cusp of the redemption. The doors are the equals of the Mashiach, at this generation of the heels of Mashiach prior to Mashiach come. We are in our entirety a reincarnation of the generation of those that left Mitzrayim. Kach, to such a degree, so that's even more strengthened the comparison of the one whose yahrzeit is on Yud Shvat, the leader of our generation, which is the Moshe of our generation, to the Moshe of his generation. That, in other words, to the Moshe that we all know of, Moshe Rabbeinu, has even more similarity with our own personal Moshe, because since our generation prior to Mashiach's coming is considered the reincarnation of that generation. Moshe, who goel rishon, who goel achron, the Chazal say, Moshe was the first redeemer, took the Yidnar Mitzrayim, and he's also the final redeemer. Is saying the same thing. The Frierdiker Rebbe is dealing with our generation. He's our final redeemer. He is the Moshe of our generation that incorporates the avodah and the idea that took place by Moshe of his generation. Meduber come upon, like explained many times, that the leader of our generation, in other words, the Frierdiker Rebbe, there's a unique connection to redemption of Klal Yisrael, of this generation and all the generations, Megula, Hamitis, Vashleiman, the true and complete redemption. The Merumas Bishmoy, like it's hinted in his name, Yosef Yitzchak. How's it hinted in the Frierdiker Rebbe's name? Yosef, what's the meaning of the word Yosef and the name Yosef? Al Shem She'asad HaKadosh Baruch Hu LaHosef V'Ligos Yisrael. Because in the future Hashem will add to redeem the Yidden, Kishem Shegal Lois Mitzrayim, just as he took them out of Mitzrayim. This is what the Chazal say, the Chsiv, like it says, and they base this on a pasuk. The Chazal based from the pasuk, V'hoya b'yayim hahu Yosef Adnai Shenis Yodev V'goyim. It'll be in that day that Hashem will add his hand a second time. In other words, in addition to his redeeming the Yidden the first time around the Mitzrayim, he will additionally redeem them again when we go out of this final goal. So Yosef has to do with the future redemption. Yitzchak, Yitzchak, the name Yitzchak is called. Why was he called Yitzchak? Because whoever hears will laugh on my account. And we know that the ultimate laughter and joy will be by the redemption. Then our mouths will be filled with laughter and our tongues will be filled with song. Like we saw in actuality in the service and the way the Frierdiker Rebbe acted, it's that it stood out with the fact was specifically out of joy. And this joy is connected with the joy that will be when Mashiach comes. So the name Yosef Yitzchak has to do particularly with the Gul. How the Rebbe says, the joy by the Frierdiker Rebbe is even more surprising because of what he went through and what he was going through. And the wonder about the joy of the Frierdiker Rebbe is even stronger. When we know that he was physically The Rebbe should protect us from this. He suffered physically. Ad kedei kach, that to such a degree, sheishpiu gamal yonav haruchnim kilkamon, this influence and had an impact also on the spiritual matters, like we'll talk soon, concerning the power of speech. From this idea, it's understood even more so. How the fact that all the lights were released and opened up by the Frierdiker Rebbe, especially on the day of his yard site, including also the way he acted out of joy, comes down to every single Yid and to all Yid in our generation, that as souls and bodies were able to receive the great lights, just like it says concerning by Moshe Rabbeinu, and just like the Frierdiker Rebbe, despite the limitations of his body, was still joyous. So the same thing by us, in a similar vein, we can and we are ready and able to receive the great revelations while being souls and bodies. So he's going to explain a little bit more about what we just now said. Regardless of the fact that by the one whose yard side is a Shevat, the boil party cakes, the revelation and actuality of coming to party at this time, after the passing away, by the previous Rebbe, by the Frierdiker Rebbe, it's a revelation, but it's a revelation the way the soul is above the body, left the body, it passed away. According to what was spoken about previously, I've learned, moving it's understood, it's specifically when all the lights being opened and revealed opened up, it becomes revealed in the soul and the body. It's a the Rebbe says, as it will be by the Frierdiker Rebbe, take it from Yad Mamish immediately, when those that are resting in the ground will awaken and sing. And so therefore, we will experience it, the soul and the body. Seder is even more so. Even while being alive in this world, while the soul was in the body. The one whose yard site suffered the physical pain, physical suffering. That affected also his spiritual matters and his spiritual mission. Including in his final latter years, by the Frierdiker Rebbe in his latter years, he had difficulty speaking, and it was similar to what Moshe Rabbeinu said, I'm heavy of tongue, I have heavy of mouth and heavy of tongue. And it had practical applications and implications. Is that Paul ben Nagel Chassidus, this affected concerning the manner in which the Frierdiker Rebbe was able to give over Chassidus, spreading Torah and Yiddishkeit, and spreading the wealth of Chassidus outward. That all of this was impacted by the Frierdiker Rebbe's suffering and by the Frierdiker Rebbe's difficulty with speech. To such a degree, even his doctor, professor, in Russia they called a specialist, they called him a professor. Doesn't mean he taught in college, doesn't mean he's a specialist. That what was called a professor was an additional level higher than an ordinary doctor. He asked the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe's personal physician, asked him, in a way of a complaint, how could it be that the suffering expressed itself specifically in his power of speech, in such a manner that he cannot fulfill his mission in this world as he wishes to do so, as it's necessary for him to do so? In other words, if another type of part of his body would have been affected, it wouldn't have had such an impact on what he has to do in this world as much as the power of speech. The Frierdiker Rebbe's means, the Rabbeim's means of affecting the world was through their power of speech. Hu balelula zeshmarash kaychaza kochtzik bafotza toira v'kayadus v'afotza meos chutza. The one the one whose yahrzeit is the Frierdiker Rebbe, who makes such a big tumult, spreading Torah and Yiddishkeit and spreading the well springs of Chassidus outward. HaKadosh Baruch Hu haYetzarich, the Eibishter should have Eifoi Losses Lois Miloy have Shadas, the full capabilities Levatzea Zois B'Mida Amirbis, to be able to accomplish this in the greatest way possible. And therefore, it should have been then his capability to be in control over his power of speech. Primarily through speech is how one spreads Torah and Yiddishkeit. Through saying Mamar Chassidus, and giving direction and directives what to do. Even more so, since he is the one that makes such a big tumult about such an avodah, so then by the Frierdiker Rebbe should have been not only should have not been the negative, should have been negating anything that could stand in the way of it. Just the opposite. He should have had more capabilities in his power of speech than other people had. Not just the same, but even more, because that is what's necessary. Those are his tools to be able to accomplish his work. In Cain, how you talking? If so, how is it possible? The doctor asked. Regardless of all of the above, we see just the opposite. That the sufferings of his body affected in his physical power of speech. Is affected in the simple sense, speaking Amar Chassidus, etc. And in the simple matter, the matter affected that should be much less than would have been appropriate to be. In other words, if the Frierdiker Rebbe would not have had the problem with his speech, so seemingly, according to our physical understanding, the Frierdiker Rebbe would have said and told over much more Chassidus. Both in his speech and in saying Mamar Chassidus, there would have been more. That also in spreading out his words of Chassidus in writing. If there would have been more Mamarim, so then they would have added also in the review on the Mamarim, and also the written notes that was taken from the Mamarim. So therefore, by the fact that the Frierdiker Rebbe's speech was impacted, so therefore there wasn't so many people that there wasn't so much that could be reviewed, and there wasn't so much that could be written down. So it comes out that the Frierdiker Rebbe's impact in the speech was not just in the speaking of the Mamarim, but also in the written, printed Mamarim as well. Now the Rebbe says, in my humble opinion, something that people need to listen to more when they're quoting the Rebbe. Though it's not possible to ask questions on the way the Eibishter runs his world, and especially we can't ask questions about how the Eibishter acts with the leader of the generation. And it's impossible to say and tell Hashem, this is what should have been. And to tell Hashem, this is what shouldn't have been. So the Rebbe says, true, on the one hand, we have to be very careful, as my mother says, you got to be very careful when you speak about what Hashem chooses to do and what Hashem knows to do and what he doesn't do. Yet, on the other hand, there's something about what we need to take a lesson from. That's a totally different idea. We're not telling the Eibishter what he should have done or what he shouldn't have done, and we're not complaining about what Hashem did or shouldn't have done, but we are trying to understand and realize the lesson for this in our world. Af became Kavak or the Baruch Seder. Still, no Hashem established the order. I do not request of the Yidden according to my capabilities. I request from the Jewish people they should serve me according to their capabilities. Meaning, what does it mean in this case, according to their capabilities? That we should put an effort to be able to understand in the human intellect of every person, every Yid, according to their capabilities, we should be able to understand what exactly is going on. The frat benin the dan, especially in our situation, our case. This is not just a question by the intellect of a doctor. The above mentioned question: how is it possible? The leader of generation is not able to fulfill his mission as he desires to do. Ella, but the question is, this is not appropriate according to Torah that the Rebbe should not have the capability to be able to express himself. Moving Mizel, like it's understood from that in the Torah itself it's recorded that Moshe complained to Hashem or argued with Hashem and said, Kvad pev, kvad lashon anochi. I'm heavy of mouth, I'm heavy of tongue, Vanyad also Simon, I'm stopped up, my lips are stopped up, V'lachein, shlachna, b'yad tishlach, please send, and whoever you will send with. And the Rebbe did not say that your complaints are wrong, but he said, Anole HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem responded to him immediately, I will be with your mouth. Well, you stop it, and that was the Eibush was not satisfied with that, and just to say, "I will be with your mouth," that Aaron, your brother, will be for you a spokesman. Through Aaron, that's how Moshe's words came out in a physical speech and actuality. So therefore, we see that the Eibush considered Moshe Rabbeinu's complaint a valid complaint. The Rebbe says that in a similar way was the Friedrich by the Friedrich Rebbe. Yeah, Shlomo, we could say, this was the way how it was by the Friedrich Rebbe. This is reflecting what was by Moshe Rabbeinu in his generation, like we said in Vav of the Sicha. Since the refinement of the world was not yet complete, therefore speech is in exile. We mentioned earlier, that during the time of exile, the level of speech is in the state of exile as well. And we also spoke about that Moshe on his own is beyond the revelation of speech. And despite that, Hashem could have miraculously healed Moshe Rabbeinu. Still, no, Hashem didn't do that. HaKadosh Baruch Hu Hashem did not heal Moshe Rabbeinu. He made a miracle. That I will be with your mouth. That his words, that your words will be the way it's supposed to be. When is the completion of the matter and the fulfillment of the matter done in its ultimate way by the power of the Friedrich Rebbe through souls and bodies, the shamas brias begufim briim, in healthy souls and healthy bodies. So the reinu of our generation, Hadoir Hachi, the ninth generation. In other words, the Rebbe is the ninth Rebbe since the Baal Shem Tov. From the Alter Rebbe to the Rebbe is called Doir Hashvi, the seventh generation from the Alter Rebbe, but he's the ninth generation from the Baal Shem Tov. So the Rebbe is saying that the ninth generation, which is more like a euphemism for the Rebbe himself, the Rebbe always is very inclusive, and he doesn't talk about him being the seventh Rebbe. He says about the seventh generation. The same thing over here. He doesn't say about him being the ninth Rebbe. He says the ninth generation. That it's in our possible capability. We have to be at the level of Aaron, your brother will be your prophet or your mouthpiece or your spokesman. Through expressing an actual speech in such a way that the speech is even heard to the house of Pari or B'Shef Arav, and with a lot of hashpa, the Torah, Vayros, the Balei Lula, all the words of Torah and the directives of the one whose yahrzeit it is. That in this generation will become fulfilled what it says that you shall send with the one who you are sending, that Moshe Rabbeinu was meaning send the Rei Mashiach. Shaydei Mashiach said Kainu Mismal B'Shleimus Gilu Yoiris B'Klei Adibur Kanal Sevav. That's when Mashiach said Kainu becomes fulfilled completely the revelation of the lights in the vessels of speech. Now the Rebbe said this interestingly about a month and a half before or more than a month and a half before Chav Zayin Adar, when the Rebbe's speech was taken away. So the Rebbe handed it off to us as well, being the spokesperson and the Aharon to the Rebbe being Moshe. And the Rebbe goes on to say, via Shleimer we could say, Shezem Merumas Gam B'Rosh Tevis Shel Miyad. The Rebbe says this a lot of times. That says miyad, that miyad hemigolim, immediately. What is the miyad? What's the Rosh Tevis of the word miyad? Moshe and Yisrael, meaning Abal Shem Tov, and David, which represents Mashiach, Malka Mashiach. David is the one who Mashiach comes from, and Mashiach is called by the name of David. David Avdi is often referring to Mashiach. Shleimus Avedase Shel Moshe V'Avodas Abal Shem Tov, the ultimate perfection of Moshe. And the avodah of the Baal Shem Tov, which the avodah of the Baal Shem Tov is not just the Baal Shem Tov itself, but also our kol Rabbi Seinu and Sienu includes all of our Rebbeim, our leaders. Adon Sidareinu, the leader of our generation, for the Yud of Baal Shem Tov, the Yud of Yisrael, of the word Miyad, includes all the Rebbeim. Fellas, David Malcolm Mashiach is affected through David, the King Mashiach. Shlach Nabiyad Tishlach. That's when it becomes finalized and completed in its utmost way. Then the Rebbe, as like in many sichas of those years, the Rebbe would always connect it with the particular day of the week it was. He would connect it with the parsha, would connect it with the day of the week, would connect it with the date in the calendar. Here, the Rebbe is going to speak about a particular date when Yud Shvat came out in the year Tafshin Beis, when the sicha was set. We could say that this matter is also hinted in the calendar date of when Yud Shvat comes out in this year, in the fourth day of the week. The Chazal say that then the lights were, the luminaries were removed. That was a time when the moon was lessened. That very day, the luminaries were hung in the heavens. So the Rebbe says there is this type of relationship between luminaries being taken and luminaries being hung, which is seemingly opposite. Either they're being taken away or they're being given. The Rebbe says, in the day of Yud Shvat, it was the date of the passing of my father-in-law, the Frierdiker Rebbe, Nitlo Hama-Oiris, with a tough, that they were taken away, the luminaries, but not in such a manner that they remain taken away. Elamiha Nitlu, with a test, Nasu Miyad Nitlu, from a nitlu with a test, which means taken away, it becomes immediately that they were hung in the heavens, the two great luminaries, in a much greater and more elevated way, Yadu, as it's known. Through the passing of a tzaddik becomes an even higher ascent in revelation, from a level where the glory of Hashem becomes elevated and in all the world. Like the Alter Rebbe says over there in the Geras HaKodesh. And then the neshama is found in all the worlds more so than he was found when he was alive. And through his chassidim and through his talmidim, that are connected to him while being souls and bodies. Down here below in the ninth generation, the Rebbe says, parenthetically, Chi begins with the letter Tav. Al derech hataf, the nitlu l'gabates, the nitlu, just like the letter Tav of the word nitlu, which means they were hung and they were revealed, over the test of the word nitlu, which means taken away. Fellas gam lamata shlemis, the nitla amoidus is affected also down here below. The perfection of and the completion that the luminaries were hung, meaning is periu vizgalimene kol nahorin becomes opened and revealed from it all the lights, benesham beguf labata, and the soul and the body down here below. From this is understood the novelty and uniqueness of our generation, the ninth generation, like we said before, in comparison to all the generations prior to this, until and including even the generation prior to this, the immediately prior to this one, the eighth generation. In other words, the Rebbe is saying that the ninth generation has something even greater even than the eighth generation. Since in actuality the Geula did not come in the eighth generation, in the lifetime of the Frierdiker Rebbe, the come to Pari, the revelation of all the lights down here below. It was not in a perfect, a completed way, like a soul in a physical body that's healthy. So there was the soul passing from the body. Also, the soul in the body was in such a state where even when he was alive, the speech was in exile, like we said before. As opposed to this generation that Rebbe says, the ninth generation. The final generation of exile. The first generation of the redemption. Nasa taketh miyad nitlu amoris becomes immediately the luminaries are hung in the sky. Not only is it not lacking, heaven forbid, in the great luminaries of revealing, meaning what's it mean, the great luminaries? It says in commentaries, the great luminaries is talking about both the written Torah and the oral Torah. But just the opposite. They said the shlemis nihilus yoser, it's at an even greater perfection. Not just in the way that it's heavy of mouth from the oral Torah, and heavy of tongue from the written Torah, like we mentioned before, an explanation in that type of expression used about Moshe Rabbeinu, that he was heavy of mouth and heavy of tongue. Why? Why was he heavy of those two things? Because he was beyond coming down to reveal that. So it's not in that type of way, but in such a manner that souls in bodies, we receive in an internalized fashion, that it's a revelation of all the lights that are now being hung up. Through Mashiach coming immediately. Shlach like Moshe Rabbeinu send with whoever you're going to send, meaning Mashiach. You will teach Torah to the entire nation. Ad Torah until it will be a new Torah will come out from it. Is that the that this final generation that's going to finally accomplish this affects the perfection and the elevation of all the generations prior to it. Through the fact that all those that are resting in the ground will awaken and they will sing, so all the generations will become elevated, and the one whose yahrzeit is Shevat at our head. Rebbe goes on to say, the novelty and uniqueness of our generation in regards and in comparison to the generations prior to this, we see in actuality in the work of our generation, in this generation, Noisa was added ad shaloi be'erech, in a way of that incomparable. Legaba adoides shalifnes, in regards to the generation prior to this, va'avoida da afotzas ha'torah va'yadus, and the avoid of spreading Torah and Yiddishkeit, va'afotzas ha'mayonos putza, and spreading the well springs outward. Hein beribi hashefa asfarim ha'idvasim chulu, whether it's the multitude of ashpa, of the svarim that are printed, that's how much was spread, so much more so than in the generation of the Frierdiker Rebbe. The Hein Ba'asiyas Kol Olam, and also in making the entire world. Ad lechutza she'en chutza menu, until something that's outward, that does nothing as outward as it. Kli l'kabolas ha'oros hagdolim, a vessel for receiving these great lights. Hein b'negel b'nei Yisrael, both concerning the Yidden, ha'idea taryag mitzvahs, through the 613 mitzvahs, we are making them kalim for receiving the great light. Ein b'negel u'masoilim, both concerning the nations of the world, we make them receptacle for it. Idea of spreading about the 7 mitzvah noach. In such a way that we're illuminating the entire world with the mitzvah is a candle and the Torah is a light. In such a way that all the lights are opened up. Every person to receive the light as a healthy neshama and a healthy body. Till we see in actuality, like we've spoken about many times lately, that the nations of the world in many, many countries are assisting the Yidden in their service, similar to and even more so than it was when they went on Mitzrayim. In other words, we said earlier that the nations gave them the Egyptians gave them all the things that they asked for, and they gave them even more than what they asked for, and they sent them out and so on. But the way the nations assist is even more than what the Egyptians did then. Even to such degree that in that country is a term that the Rebbe constantly used for the Soviet Union, for Russia, that it was closed off entirely for many, many years. They didn't allow Yidden to leave the Soviet Union. And they did not give the possibility for Yidden to fulfill Torah mitzvahs completely. The latest time that was changed from one extreme to another extreme. Not only do they allow Yidden to act the way they wish to act, they allow them to leave there. Also, they assist the Yidden to leave that place. They'll be seen in actuality today that the Yidden are standing prepared, all of you, for the redemption. Also, the nations of the world are standing, all of you, ready. That are standing ready for Yidden to go out already for the exile. They should go to Israel in the true and complete redemption. In the shamas begufim, souls and bodies, belishum hefseklal, without any cessation, like we said, between being the souls and bodies of our time and the souls and bodies of Tchias HaMesim. They come immediately to ultimate perfection, the Baal Pari, they shall come al Pari, the true and complete redemption, the ultimate revelation, that all the lights will be opened up. It says about Mashiach's times that Hashem will be for you a light, an everlasting light.